It's called The Gods. Pluto and Uranus, shadows overhead at my birth during another nuclear test. Soon I will be blown across the kitchen by a toaster. Blackened bulbs sit in pits of Mount St. Helens ash, grieving the bulldozing of everything in back of us. It will rain, and from our rain-slid hillside, I will be exhumed with my illiterate grandmothers clutching the dresses of their lost diphtheric children. Saturn will lock their diaries. Neptune will know what's in them. Mars will fight with loggers and old men, and from the Space Needle, Venus will wave and throw down enough cash to leave. Thank you, halogen moon, for my bed that looks over the last forest before it folds, for your light and the coyotes that tried to tell us.
All right, welcome to another episode of Poets in Montana, and today's poet and guest is Jenny Montgomery. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Mark.
It's a pleasure. I just read that poem earlier this morning. So I was just in Seattle, and so all those, you've spent a lot of time out there.
That's right, yeah. My people came out of the sawmill communities on the Columbia River. So my parents were in grade school together, and they were the first in their family line to be educated.
Ah, yeah.
So then my dad moves up to the middle class, or the white collar class, and works for Boeing and Weyerhaeuser, and here we are in Tacoma, living on Puyallup Reservation land. But I had no idea it was Puyallup Reservation land, because in Tacoma the Indians were moved from one side of the bay to the other, and then everybody said, "Oh, now we want that land too," and they bought it piecemeal.
Right.
From them. So there were about maybe 4 Indian families
Yeah.
on that side of Tacoma. But there was a beautiful wetland there. And in the 70s, that was being bulldozed and turned into tract housing. And
Yeah.
so it was a kind of a no place and a someplace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did notice too, we made a drive up north while we were over there, and the reservations that, popped up, these little tiny parcels for the different tribes
Yeah.
along the way, and it's like, yeah, I mean, they're all Salish speakers, right, in that part of the country, or a lot of them were?
Yeah, those they've done a lot to preserve it, and the Puyallup tribe is doing well now because they control part of the port.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So and since I'm hot off of reading your poems, the Tacoma references reminded me of that Tacoma poem that I read this morning, which you want to share that with us? Since we're on this whole Seattle
right.
home
Roots.
ground.
Yeah, so Tacoma was an interesting place to grow up in the 70s. It was kind of like the Detroit of Washington State.
Right.
It was an industrial catastrophe,
Yeah.
and it was a blighted downtown. So, and I had to pass through there on my way to high school.
Mhm.
So this is about me and my friends, and experiencing psychedelics at this moment where the mushrooms were just there.
Right.
They were just in the forest, and they were in the pastures. So this is called Puget's Children. It is a relief to pass beyond the flesh and become instead a column of information. Puerile, we watch pulp mills break down the big coastal forests with sulfite. Tender mushrooms from distant pastures, we grind them into a dust, a magic, telepathy inside the car. Tacoma's air of putrefaction, old coats, this soft language streaming down through rain clouds into the olds, entering holes in the tops of our heads. Lights of the mills and the port make sequins, blurring the hills across the bay where our houses look back from behind cedars. Proof of something riding the night breeze. The old gods can't be heard from over and above, but salt travels on wind into our cotton mouths. stepping over a pool of beauty bark and cultivars with nothing to say. We drive 5 miles an hour through the Asarco Tunnel, etched with lesions, listening for sea lions. Leshai was hung for refusing to give up this grassland.
Yeah, I thought that was a fun journey. Anybody that's ever, been on that journey.
Yeah.
You do a good job of capturing it. And you've given us the landscape of that particular place and time. And Leshai
was the chief who was just swindled and bamboozled and fought really, really hard
Right.
to keep that land, and was eventually hung.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so trying to make sense of, kind of waking up to news of your birth in a very odd place and time,
Mm-hmm.
preparing to make sense of life and choose your course. Yeah. So now.
Yeah, and just awakening to the realities of history and where you're at and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So much of the stuff that they don't want kids to pay attention to now, I guess, or anybody, in terms of a lot of
Right.
the political action that we're seeing. As the bills just keep being signed into law.
Right, and then wondering if it's possible to connect with anything authentic, and the value of deep listening.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what you're up to. That's what we're up to here. We're trying to keep the deep listening going if we can.
Right, but we're not on psychedelics.
Not right now.
Not right now.
Not at the moment. But give us a minute.
That's right.
No, I mean, the beauty of psychedelics, I thought, was that they kind of opened a door, and they gave you a different perspective. And it's not like you don't have to do this, a lot more of this over and over again. I mean, it's like once the door is open, it's like, that's the big awakening right there, it seemed like.
Right, seeing some of the artifice of beauty bark and plants that are designed to give us a quick visual hit of either class status or but they've been even deprived of their plantness, and the big trees that are being ground up. So all the machinery of industrialization that supported me, I was supported by sawmills and
Right.
Boeing and Weyerhaeuser. That's what I came from. Yeah, and yet a sense of also there are the entheogen theories of religion and culture, that's originally what was opening people up to contact with really big archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
And are we just denatured modern people like those cultivars, or do we have the ability to receive a download?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we? Well, when did you sort of know that you were like the person who was going to be scribbling these thoughts and poems, words down as poems?
Yeah, I guess I was maybe identified as like problem child at some point, and I ended up in the lobby of a shrink, and they had an anthology of poetry in the waiting room, written by high schoolers, and it was probably some writing program in Tacoma, Poets in the Schools type thing. And the shrink allowed me to take that home, and I was really, really moved by that. And then I had some really great English teachers in high school, and then when I got to Evergreen, that was, writing and literature just really was a lifeline.
Right.
Real lifeline, and it's really, so I would say great teachers, real teachers.
Yeah. So you were in high school?
Yeah, I was in high school. I think actually like 9th grade, I had a notebook, just filled with terrible, terrible poetry.
Right.
But it was really a lifeline of just
Right.
trying to grope forward and give some voice to unspeakable, unclear conditions in the psyche. So yeah, that from there on in. And then at 19, I was still living in Olympia, and a friend and I went to shop for groceries, and the grocery bag had a bunch of coupons on it. One of them, New York City, $200. Cut that out. And we had $200, so we went to New York, and her mother was a poet living in the East Village.
Oh, wow.
So just kind of got wormholed into the poetry. Poetry slams were just getting started. The New York Poets Cafe. I think the night we got there, this poet Zoe Inglesey was going to perform at the New York Poets Cafe. Boom!
Yeah.
Wow, poetry is it's politics, it's liberation, it's sound, it's performance, it's something to fight about and argue about and care about, and
Right.
so then I found a different set of mentors, and I worked for a blind professor. His name was Steve Cannon. He was African-American man from New Orleans who mentored 3 generations of writers in the East Village. And so I would bring him his coffee and his newspaper in the morning, help him do his emails. He was pretty vision impaired, walk with him to the bank, and he would respond to writing or give me books to read. And we published a magazine there in the neighborhood called A Gathering the Tribes, and it was multicultural, multilingual. So I was an editor on that, and I would publish comics and stuff like that. So, yeah, and then I was mentored by a poet who was a street poet, and we kind of have street poets, or have had in Missoula, but somebody you might meet walking across the bridge, Dave Thompson or somebody who'd be like, here's a poem.
Right.
So you'd run into John Ferris on the street, and he was a mixed race guy who had been in prison for some minor weed possession thing, but he'd been in prison long enough to memorize the I Ching.
Wow. That's a while.
And he was kind of taken care of by the neighborhood, and he lived in a squat with some artists, but you just run into John, and he would pull out a crumpled old piece of paper, on the corner of 3rd and B, and just like there it was.
Yeah.
And so I kind of adhered myself to this older guy. Again, it was like a helping relationship, and I would say my poetry is really, really influenced by John's poetry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. That's a good journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff.
Yeah, I did a little bit. I'd taken courses in the MFA here, and
Right, I knew that.
Yeah, I always knew I wanted to come to Missoula in college. Richard Hugo was, the reason I wrote a lot of bad poetry in my early 20s.
Well,
But
a
I
lot of people did.
Yeah,
Myself
oh my
included.
God, yeah. But really, really admired. I felt like there were writers in Missoula, and I would end up here someday. So yeah.
Yeah, and so you did attend the MFA program here, and did you any particular experience or anything there?
Melissa Kwasny is another big hero of mine, and just such a beautiful, kind of humble, cosmic seer. Anyway, I took her prosody class, and that was really helpful and illuminating. She had us memorize a lot of poetry every week.
Yeah.
So the academic poetry started to get a little more rarefied, and trying to figure out, there's we all have our class issues.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And I think there's a part of me that was like, wanted to be more with the street poets than the academic poets. And also sad that, people I knew would hear that I was writing poetry, they say, well, I can't understand poetry. Actually, nobody has taught me how to do it. We've so far removed from the primal function of this kind of language. So then I don't know, I guess I'm trying to come back maybe more to a colloquial voice. But it's good to have that training, you know.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I did the same thing basically, and Melissa and I were in prosody class together.
Oh my gosh!
At
With
the
who?
university. Who was the teacher?
Who was teaching?
Mark Levine,
Mark
I believe,
Levine,
was the teacher.
wow.
You know, Mark Levine comes from the tradition of Jory Graham and this kind of further back language poets kind of tradition.
Right.
And so it was very. It was a very sort of distant. It was a different form of poetry than like, you know, street poetry or Richard Hugo poetry for that matter. And but he was spot on in terms of teaching a course in prosody, which was just to train you to pay attention to the line, the meter in the line, and the different forms, and just explore and to work at it. So I mean, that was the beauty of it. I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to go to the school, was to just work on the craft of poetry.
Right.
Because I've been in a street poet kind of mindset and tradition, and it didn't really pay that much attention to the craft or the actual line or anything. It just kind of
intuitive. There may be a lot of reading and a lot of experience, but it's coming out of an intuitive place.
Yeah, and so I mean, so you take both of that. You try to take as much as you can, and then you keep moving and doing your thing. And so why don't you share another poem?
Okay, cool. So in 2009, I had my son, and that was just such an amazing turning point, because he was actually born with no signs of life. And within the first day, you know, I was aware that he would live with some form of physical disability. And so it was a really sudden collision with the hand of fate, you know, and yet I could see through all of the wires and the silicone tubing and all the apparatus of the medical world that saved his life and was keeping him alive, that, you know, within a few days he began to show, he began to smile, and he began to be very present as a soul. And so I think poetry helped me work through fear, and also learning to encounter not my projection or my anxiety or could I do this job, but to find the person on the other side and start to have some lightness, living inside disability culture and coming to understand what that even was. And starting to be interested in things like constraint. You know, as poets, we'll take on constraint in a poetic form, because we know that the grindstone of the constraint is going to generate something ingenious, something unexpected. Anyway, so I did a little chapbook about that, and this is the first poem. It's called Delivery. After falling and crashing face down on an unnamed part of earth, through broken shell and ripe milk, we crept with rapid breath through a forest where cherubim dropped like shot birds. The baby gazed out, warm at my neck, read my set jaw, the wreckage, the rocking horizon, and was mostly happy, I noticed, despite having expired, yes, for a bit. Awoke before I did. Now we were made of something else. We were orbs striking bumpers, aimed by law again and again, back into the eccentric orbit that was ours and secretly everything's. Angles of incidence and reflection, angels who could be counted on to touch the limits, the limits, the limits, and the unlimited from which we fell.
Nice. Yeah.
So I was in Chris Dombrowski's, I dropped my kid off at kindergarten, had a few free hours in the day, promptly signed up for Chris Dombrowski's poetry workshop through the 406. And I hadn't written in 5, years. I'd just been in a haze. And so I just have to appreciate him so much.
Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my gosh. And a great group of people in that class. Jillian Kessler, and some other wonderful folks, and Melissa Stevenson, and it was just as good as anything in the MFA.
Right.
He would come in with poems for us to read, and he would give us amazing constraints as prompts.
Right.
You got to use this word, and you got to have this direction, and you got to have, a can of Coke, and really, really wonderful. So. Anyway, I was able to hammer this out in the company of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of Chris, I've been haunting him since we started recording this, and of course he's very busy and keeps giving me that. I'm really busy, and it's like, okay,
Now's a good time.
Got my eye.
I would call him because the river's still high, school is out.
You've got no excuses now.
Yes.
You can't dodge me.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, not a lot of people, but several people have expressed that they really are not too excited about, sitting down on camera and yabbering, this kind of way. And I understand that. And that's not Chris. He hasn't said that. So hopefully we get his, butt in that chair before we're through.
Right.
But I mean, that's this book that I just, delinquently didn't read until today. When did this book come out?
In 2016, I did this, and I did it in sort of with a gallery show. So I had a gallery show during the book festival that year, which was attempting to take some of the images in the poem and build them in the space, and have a lot of, had a lot of medical equipment and children's toys, and it was I think, there was a lot of text involved in any highly medical situation. It's textualized in these reports. Someone does a test on you and they give you a report, and here's your body and language, and so I'm getting all this text about my baby that's whatever, devastating damage or permanent and severe and blah blah blah, and it's I took a lot of those records and I shredded them and I made art out of them, and I was tearing up medical books, and I was trying to redocument something that had been kind of aggressively documented for us.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, from that cold sort of scientific platform, as opposed to dealing with life, which is where you were. Yeah. I of course, I first I think I first kind of encountered you through your son.
Yeah.
And because I remember seeing Heath in Paxton Elementary. I used to teach poetry there in Paxton all the time, and I started walking in, and I'd see this kid out in the hall, and he was either in a chair or a walker, and he usually had somebody else with him. A lot of times he wasn't. He was just there by himself, but he was always, bright-eyed, and you could tell that there was a lot of fire in the furnace. He was engaging with whoever was walking by, and so I was kind of got into a hi there, ho there relationship with him in the hallway, because he was still too young to be in any of the classes that I was working with poetry in. And then, of course, you guys brought him to a reading, and and it was and I was freaked out because he was 8 years old?
Yeah, we were right in the front row, and I hadn't been to a reading of yours. I was really excited. I'd read some of your work, but I hadn't been to a reading, and this was very colorful language, and there was some profanity and but anyway, he absorbed it all, went home and wrote a poem in the style of Mark Gibbons, but I wish we had it.
It was it was like every Hugo student, right?
Yes,
I mean, it was exactly almost word for word, and he got those voices down because it was a character it was a voice poem.
Yeah.
And he had a voice down all his own, pretty similar, but
Yeah, I think the last line is something like, "We're gonna get those fucking coyotes."
yeah. We're gonna get those sons of bitches
Those
or
sons of
whatever.
bitches,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was. Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
But then I got a chance to spend some time with him in one little summer session.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was just and I thought, wow, that's amazing. He was just so gifted verbally and mentally, obviously. And I guess he doesn't fall far from the tree. Huh?
Well, it's interesting when he doesn't have the physical ability to bounce off the walls and run down the street and jump off the sofa. So he's become really observant. And I think I'd like to read this poem. It's called "A Few Pointers."
Yeah.
And this is, which I think I had in mind, like if you've had a meditation teacher, a Zen master, or anything like that, you sometimes get this advice, a
Right.
pointer.
Right.
So these are some of what I imagine might be his pointers based on what he was doing at the time. Roll yourself in a blanket and yell, "Crush me." Remark upon your handsomeness. Pretend to be a neurologist. X-ray everyone. Stick out your hand and say hello. Use a magnifying glass. Say, "But it's my opinion." Extend your right arm fully. Feel your wheelchair spin in snow. Lift the flap to read, "Some changelings might forget they are not human." Learn to use a toaster. When given a free Disney cruise by the highway patrol, ask why. Hug Goofy. Hum Tchaikovsky when battling your enemies. Stand in braces for 11 seconds. If someone says that doesn't look fun, drive backwards. Admire Marvin Luther King Jr. Refer to your right hand in the third person and refuse to leave the lingerie department. Consider the dust which once blocked the sun. Honk like a Parasaurolophus and ignore the phrase, "Great job." Ask, is God respectful and responsible? Know your carnivores. Ask, is death an okay thing? Take 7 steps in water. Lift the flap to read, the sickly, clever little boy had brought meditation and joy into the house. Be constantly aware of something without stopping. What kind of dinosaur never gives up? A triceratops. Help those who say, "Is that the wrong word?" Enchant the perplexed. Tell those who haven't noticed it's spring, but the snow began. Carry gum and a ray gun. Tiptoe on your knees.
Yeah, that's great. And that works for anything. It doesn't matter whether I mean, it doesn't. I mean, that's the beauty of poetry, I think, is you can act like a child.
Yeah.
When you read a poem, and you can become a child, and yeah, all those great thoughts in the mind, and of course it even adds more to it to know that you're talking about a child who is kind of trapped in their mind more than the average Joe, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it reflects the conditions under which it was written when time is very fragmented.
Right.
And I would just kind of, over the course of the week, like notice little things and make a note. Notice something and make a note. And then it was just a little collage at the end of the week
Accumulation, right.
of what I'd seen, of little moments. And I think I wrote in an hour, It
Right.
was just really simple little craft project. And
Right.
yeah.
But it works really well, particularly in a poem, because it condenses all that in a much more of a
Yeah.
flashpoint kind of a situation. They come so fast. That's interesting, the way that works.
And humor is so important, whenever you are wearing a little bit of difference, then you become you're going to feel people's projections. You'll feel their fear. You'll feel anxiety. It's the human encounter with fragility or
Right.
mortality, or
Right.
so things like, oh, did I say the right word, or
Right.
great job, it's like little expressions of anxiety that are well-meaning,
Yeah.
but in a way like attempts to connect, and then what that must be like.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at all the great comedians, I mean, and they all come from groups or individual situations that make them a focal point, and not in a good way, and so they joke
Yeah.
about it to disarm that, and to get attention and to get respect
Right.
through
right.
humor.
Yeah, there's a kind of lightness. My friend Darius James, who's an artist I knew back in New York, he wrote a book on African American humor, and the ability to move with lightness
Right.
inside of a situation that you may not control
Right.
is, which is all of us, which is
Right.
the
Right.
condition of being human. So yeah, I think that humor is it's important to be able to laugh, and Heath really delights in making up jokes about disability, and
Right.
improv comedy has become his thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also a great tool for education, because once you get them in your hip pocket with their
Yeah.
laughing along with you,
Yeah.
then you can turn the ball and like throw something
Right.
like really serious, like Richard Pryor, or whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
whoa, holy shit.
Right, right. Or Key and Peele, or
Yeah, exactly, the serious
yeah,
business.
yeah, the little edge, the humor with the little edge of horror, and
Right.
yeah, Dave Chappelle. Yeah, so I think another great teaching has been like, who are we to think that we're normal? But, like,
Right. What is normal?
What is
know?
normal? Who is uninjured?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everybody's different, and that's one of the things that seems like is a process that we're slowly evolving into. I mean, it's such of a painful, slow process, and then you've got always this constant conservative, fearful pushback, against
Yeah.
all this progress that's being made. My son is a scientist, and so, I mean, there's that angle that you see it from that point of view too. It's this constant, slow
Yeah.
progression. And their whole idea that he's dealing with right now is to try to treat, eventually, medicine will be an individualized
yes,
treatment.
personalized
right?
medicine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's the way it has to be in a way. You can't come up with one drug and
Yeah.
solve every problem for every person. We're all a little different.
We have our temperament, that
Yeah.
that medieval medical concept that some of us are cold and dry, and others are warm and humid, and
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I have a poem that has to do with that,
Good.
and it's so this was at the Nutcracker, and
yeah.
and I was watching this incredible performance. We have a great dance program in Missoula. Kids of all ages, kind of up to the very skilled. They bring in the out of town, dancers for these big roles, but also noticing and having learned that ballet can hurt your body, right?
Yeah.
It can injure you permanently, and artists too. We all know artists whose lives have become the wreckage behind their work.
Right, right.
And so anyway, this is a little reflection on the idea of, who's injured and who's not. Ballet with boy and wheelchair. Half the little blonde girls in town must be here. Their entourage is filling the seats. Here she comes, the one little mouse or sheep pawing at her ear in the hindmost row. Out front, the more promising dancers, 12 or 14, and soon the college girls, in costumes that reveal veinous tissue, stiff chiffon, brief peaks of organdy, lime, Prussian blue, stuck straight out like orbiting rings, cannons that spit glitter so all the mice fall down, crystals pasted on bodices where the upper chests respire under the light of snowfall. Great artifice that transports the boy at my side who can only repeat, "Oh God, his rosary of overawe at the battle of soldiers and mice, the dazzling red of the hero without his head, and the animal king run through by his blade. Oh my God! The seated mothers who could plots from the practices, the young ones leaping the whole thing, a battle to fly, to fix above the ground their scant weight and light, the materials that float, the flakes made to shimmer slowly down, shaken from dark buckets by invisible texts, the unflying army in the wings, the old ballerina, gray and glorious, who frets and describes for them what it feels like to possess ballon, to spring without effort and pose in midair. The little mouse who forgets, musculature, bravura, the maturity of the leads brought in from out of town, the paradox of supreme control, unnatural turnings, the knee and foot being slowly ruined in the service of flight, air, grand jeté, and legs beating like wings. What bodies can pass through before dropping down into this mine of sylphs, willies, and ghosts? Oh God, this cannot be human, but on point like the feet of flowers, no feet at all. Boy at my side who imagines dancing as they do, who sees these bodies, miracles of duration and reformation, the massive thighs of the ballerino, and what we can all see defying what we thought was a law, the magic no child can sit still for. I recall being taken at a tender age and with emphatic yearning and fear, sensing we could embody heavenly forces at great cost. Dysplasia, cam and pincer deformity among the elite. We sit with our incapacities, applauding the hero who leaps for it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed, I guess, when you sent me the poems you sent me to look at, was that there was a great variety in style in the poems that you sent me. So you like to play around in all kinds of poetic forms. I mean, that's a prose poem, obviously.
Yeah,
It just moves so fast and so fluently. And does a great job of capturing that whole ballet experience. That's the Nutcracker.
Yeah.
What was the title?
That's
Ballet?
just called Ballet with Boy in Wheelchair.
Oh, okay.
You know, and he literally sat there through the whole thing just going, oh my God, God, like
Yeah, I get it.
the spectacle. But yeah, it's, you know, and sometimes it hurts to be a poet. Sometimes it hurts when we can't get to what we imagine, or we've taken a lot of time away from our loved ones, or something else in life,
Right.
you know, that's preoccupied us. And so this idea of the body being kind of ruined by the work, and then the old dancers, you know, trying to explain it to it's like, what if we are all of those, you know? What if we have like the old ruined sage in us and the child who, you know, is fiddling with their costume?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought about that, I guess, too. You know, I mean, you have these thoughts that if you spend so much time, you know, in your own head, in your own little fascination with what's going on in life, and not if you have a family, and not as much time as you. But you know, there's the other side of it too. That like you said, you know, in terms of not trying to have that sort of parental control or whatever that we expect to have. I mean, you're kind of born. You're born into it, right?
Yeah.
When they come, it's like, oh, this is your job, baby. You're along for the duration.
You don't know what you're gonna get. Yeah.
But at some point, you have to kind of, you know, just kind of let go, and that's a tough thing to do for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you feel guilty to an extent sometimes, I think, if you aren't always there.
Right, or if you really want to be, you want that solitude. You know, you've had a weekend to yourself, and you don't want it to end. You know? Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot. Some of my, you know, and then there's the whole question of like success as a poet. Like, what does that even mean? You know, and I had some friends and. From the old neighborhood in New York who became really successful. And yet, you know, sometimes I think on the personal level, like paid a big price.
Right.
And so to be a householder and to be a worker and to be practicing poetry in a relative obscurity is like, you know, to me, some of the most important poets are not names that anybody else knows. You know, they're this guy from my old neighborhood. It's you, it's Chris, it's Jillian, it's, you know. To be a success almost in that particular realm is like, well, it's just like, that doesn't even make sense. I mean, what is a success? I mean, to begin with, I guess. In this country, I think success equates to money. Usually, and fame. And attention.
Fame and money and attention, exactly. And you know, that's not exactly what you do as a poet doesn't really equate to that, as far as I can see. And if you would think it would poison the well, if nothing else, you know. Yeah. To kind of distract you from what you want to do, which is just that. What you're doing right there,
to be in your ecosystem. Yeah. And to cross-fertilize with poets and people around you. But that's, you know, I have my bookshelf of poetry, you know, and I've got dead poets and old poets and famous poets, and then I have all these chapbooks and small books by people I know. Right. And it's like, oh, my heart just goes there, you know. And Philip Schaeffer, I really have, you know, we got to be good friends and used to trade poetry weekly, and it's like I just know some of his poems as well as I know, you know, Yanis Ritsos or other people that I admire. And one poet that meant a lot to me was I don't know why, but Louis Zukofsky. Like it's kind of, you know, it's like it's language poetry, but the story behind it, I think it comes back to this kind of underdog thing because he grew up as a Yiddish speaker. And English was his second language. And then he got into Columbia at a time when, you know, you could get in as a Jew, but you're definitely underclass. Right. And so the way that he played with English, like he's like, I'm going to master it, but I'm going to kind of use it in playful ways. And so he played a lot of games with English and Yiddish and forms. And, you know, it was not a famous, well-known poet, really, but I guess it's like people like that who they're trying to find out something, and also it's helping them become who they are. Right.
Well, and there's just so many poets, you know. I mean, there's so many that are in books and you know, at Powell's or wherever, you know, in these massive collections and then there's so many that aren't even there in books that are. You know, they're very. It's wonderful to experience what they do because it's them. You know, it's always an extension of who that person is, and their quirkiness, their craziness, the things that plague them in their world. And you mentioned that when we were talking earlier. Not to change the subject, but I want to, before, I don't even know where we're at in terms of time, but before we're done, you mentioned that you're working on a new project, and so what are you working on?
Yeah, so I'm working on a comic, essentially a long form comic. It's a graphic history and with some graphic memoir, and he has been a collaborator on this project. And we came across an old book when I was doing, you know, ripping up medical books, and I ordered an old book I thought was a medical book, and it was from 1935, but it turned out to be about a summer camp for disabled kids that ran in the 30s in Vermont, and it was called Robin Hood's Barn. And it was run by a couple of women. It was totally immersive, almost like psychodrama. The kids went there. They had an initiation ceremony where they became Robin Hood outlaws. They all had Robin Hood names, costumes. The women who ran the camp were lesbians, and they played Robin Hood and Little John. They were basically like in drag. It was this crazy utopian thing. And Heath was like, we need to find these. We need to find out if anyone is still alive. So we kind of went on this hunt, and we found some very, very old people who went to camp there and were related to the women, and gave us tons of archival photographs, songs, plays, poems, and it was all about the inner life. It was the opposite of the medical thing. It was, what do you do to survive spiritually and have a healthy psyche in the 30s with a physical disability and no future and no right to education? It was crazy. And
a play camp.
But it was also school, astronomy, poetry, Shakespeare, opera, but class, medieval history. And so anyway, we find this guy. He's 91. He's got CPs, living in Santa Fe. He became a theology professor, this Jewish guy. And anyway, so it's a story about putting together what the camp was and what the camp meant, but it's also a lot of Heath and I trying to figure out our relationship, disability history. So, so it's 300-page comic script, and I wrote that with Judy Blunt as my helper. I would go to her house once a week, and she would give it to me. And it's been through a lot of readers, and a lot of edits, and so we're hoping to pitch that this year and find the right artist. But one reason I think the comic book, I think it's some of the same stuff that was in the poems, but I wanted it to be really accessible, to a parent or a child struggling with their relationship, and with all the unknowns, and with what there is to celebrate also. And I just wanted it to be able to go into anybody's hands and be readable and accessible and useful. So, but I think I was saying to you, I think comics I grew up on drugstore comics, and I think that the approach to like distilled language, there's a lot of prosody in Spider-Man captions and talk bubbles, and like that. It's been very poetic to try to distill conversations into very few words, buttressed by images, and sometimes just crossing out all the words and saying like, this image is enough. So I feel it's a kind of a stealth poetry project.
Sure. And a lot of internal dialogue sections, probably, the mind going, thinking about what's going on.
Right, dialogue with past self, dialogue with dead person, you can really roam around, and comics still do mean a lot to me, but it'll be fun to get back to poetry and that, but I can only do one thing at a time with my kid business. It's
and then finding the right graphic artist that can then do that, because I mean that could make all the difference in the world,
totally,
right? I mean, as to whether it's going to really fly for you, for one thing.
And giving them the freedom to do what they do. So so we'll see, but I think poetry has to be. I like poetry that's useful to me. And, I use like Poetry Magazine, I could check out Poetry Magazine. I'm like, this is really interesting, and this is evidence of what a poem can do, but can I use it? Can I put this as fertilizer in my garden?
Will I take it away with me? Probably not.
Right.
I mean, not always. I shouldn't say that, but there's a whole hell of a lot of it out there that is like that.
Right.
And it's just like, it's fine. Maybe it's useful to somebody, but not me.
Yeah. Is it fulfilling some of that sacred purpose of orienting us to our cardinal directions, our spiritual directions, our mortality, our families, our failures, our losses. Like, these are the things that poetry is helping us bridge. And
Poems should come for me, something's got to come from.
Yeah.
Got to come from the heart. There's got to be some emotion in there somehow, somewhere for me, or I'm just not that interested. If there's no real human sort of connection, if I can't connect it somehow to being here. Yeah. Well, how about one more for the road? Because we're getting close to the end.
We're
of
getting
this
close.
puppy.
Yeah, we are. Well, we talked about different forms and constraints, and this was just a one-off, but I really loved it, and it reminded me of being a kid when you spend a lot of time outside, and you go places where no adults go, and I used to roam around in the woods a lot and build forts and, live inside certain trees. So this is just called 16 Rooms, and I think these are trying to think of these spaces as rooms, and again, this goes back to the development that was happening in the 70s when the woods were being cut down for housing.
Right,
okay.
right.
16 Rooms. A room created by the underskirts of pines. A room created by sticks and stolen fiberglass. A room created by a mattress in a ravine. A room created by mother logs. A room created by the middle of the road. A room created by fence corners. A great hall beside the ocean. A great hall on a mountaintop. A room created by a dotted line of rocks. A room created by looking for UFOs. A room created by putting your whole head in the lilacs. A room created by an acre of charcoal stumps. A chapel created by rafting through swamp. A room reached through a tunnel of wild rose. A room reached by rungs nailed to a madrona. A room or set of rooms created by newly framed houses where the whole thing is windows and ribs, no skin.
Yeah, I like that. I remember just reading that too. And this, the concept of a room with a view. A room, everything is a room for us. I love the one where you stick your head in the lilacs,
Yeah, it's that time of year.
Yeah, and just the idea of wherever your space is, whatever is in your line of vision.
Headspace.
Headspace, the room we're in.
The room. Yeah.
Well, Jenny, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing
so
all of your
much.
stuff and your stories. Join us again next time on Poets in Montana. We'll have somebody else read to you. Thanks for joining us.
A lifetime filled